The storm raged outside, hammering against the towering windows of Blackwood Hall, a grand Victorian estate standing solemnly on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Inside, the corridors lay cloaked in silence, interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock. The mansion belonged to Nathaniel Wren, a man as cold and impenetrable as the stone walls that surrounded his home. At 36 years old, Nathaniel had built his vast fortune with an unyielding sense of discipline. He was a master of control, a strategist in business who left no room for distractions. Emotions, in his eyes, were liabilities, weaknesses that had no place in his world. His name commanded both respect and fear, and those who worked for him knew better than to expect warmth. Despite his wealth, Nathaniel lived in self-imposed isolation, consumed by an endless cycle of work, power, and precision. Everything in his life followed a strict order, from his high-stakes investments to the way his home was meticulously maintained. Yet, in his pursuit of perfection, he had unknowingly built himself a prison of solitude. But change often arrives in the most unexpected ways. That change came in the form of Eleanor Whitmore, a 25-year-old woman who had just joined Blackwood Hall as a maid. Unlike the extravagance of the mansion, Eleanor's life had been shaped by hardship. She was born and raised in a quiet countryside village, where she had learned the value of hard work from an early age. With her mother's declining health, she had taken on every possible job to keep their modest home running. Eleanor was not fragile, though she looked it. Her wavy chestnut hair and delicate features made her seem softer than she truly was. What defined her was not her appearance, but the quiet resilience in her eyes, a determination forged by years of struggle. She did not believe in miracles or fairy tales. She believed in survival. When she arrived at Blackwood Hall on a rain-soaked afternoon, she carried little more than a small suitcase and a mind full of uncertainties. She had heard rumors about her new employer, the distant, unyielding man who never let anyone close. But Eleanor had no interest in gossip. She was here for one reason: to earn a living and support her mother. As she stepped inside the grand house for the first time, she was greeted by Mrs. Aldridge, the no-nonsense housekeeper who ran the estate with unwavering efficiency. The rules were clear: stay invisible, work hard, and never overstep. Eleanor listened carefully, knowing that this job was not one she could afford to lose. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. She learned the rhythms of the house, ensuring everything remained spotless, though she rarely caught sight of Nathaniel himself. He spent his days in the city, overseeing his business empire, leaving behind only the faint traces of his presence: a jacket draped over a chair, an untouched cup of coffee. He was a ghost in his own home, a man who existed only in shadows. But on the third week, fate intervened. That afternoon, a violent storm forced Nathaniel to cancel an important meeting and return home earlier than expected. The thunder rumbled overhead as he stepped inside, shaking off the rain from his coat. He was heading toward his study when something unusual caught his eye. A woman, kneeling on the marble floor of the grand hallway, carefully scrubbing the already immaculate surface. Eleanor had not noticed him. She worked with quiet precision, her hands steady, her focus unwavering. There was something about the way she carried herself, not just obedience, but purpose. Nathaniel rarely paid attention to the staff, but for some reason, he found himself lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as if snapping back into his usual self, he cleared his throat. "Who are you?" His voice was low, controlled, yet it carried the weight of command. Startled, Eleanor sprang to her feet, nearly knocking over the bucket of water beside her. Her wide eyes met his for the first time. And in that instant, though neither of them knew it yet, something had shifted. For the first time, Eleanor found herself face to face with Nathaniel Wren. He was even more imposing than she had imagined. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding the space around him with an air of quiet authority. His sharp gaze bore into her, unreadable, unwavering. In that moment, Eleanor felt small, not just in stature, but in the way his very existence seemed to overshadow everything. "I'm Eleanor, sir, the new maid," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy curling in her chest. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes slightly as if assessing her, then spoke with clipped detachment. "Stay out of the way." That was all. No further acknowledgement, no interest, just a dismissal as he turned on his heel and strode toward his office, ending the conversation as abruptly as it had begun. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter was brief, but something about it unsettled her. It wasn't just his coldness, that she had expected. It was the shadow in his eyes, something fleeting yet unmistakable, a loneliness buried beneath a carefully constructed indifference. In the days that followed, they continued to cross paths, always briefly, always formally. He was not cruel, but he was distant, locked away in an unreachable world of his own making. Nathaniel moved through the house with calculated precision, his mind seemingly consumed by matters far beyond the walls of Blackwood Hall. Eleanor worked quietly, blending into the routine, yet each encounter left a lingering curiosity in her mind. She began to notice the small details, the way he rarely smiled, the tension in his shoulders during late-night phone calls, the unspoken frustration that darkened his features when something didn't go as planned. And above all else, she noticed his solitude. For all his wealth and power, Nathaniel seemed like a man adrift, surrounded by luxury yet untouched by warmth. There was something beneath the surface, something unspoken, and despite herself, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to him more often than she cared to admit. To Nathaniel, however, Eleanor was an anomaly. She followed the rules, did her job without complaint, and never attempted to seek his attention, a trait he found both surprising and oddly intriguing. She neither feared him nor flattered him, unlike so many others in his world. She simply existed within his orbit, moving with quiet composure, never trying to belong, but never feeling out of place either. It was a small difference, but one he couldn't quite ignore. Nathaniel had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, shielding himself from unnecessary connections. To acknowledge curiosity, let alone emotion, was to invite disorder. And chaos was the one thing he refused to allow into his life. Yet, despite himself, he had begun to notice her. The days continued, each following the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the estate. Yet with each passing moment, Eleanor became more aware of Nathaniel's presence. Not because of anything he said, but simply because he was there. He was like a silent storm. His coldness didn't need words. It was in the way he dominated a room, in the way his presence alone made the air feel heavier. Eleanor, however, remained unchanged. She worked with quiet diligence, and Nathaniel treated her no differently than he did anyone else, with precise, detached indifference. To him, she was just another small part of his perfectly ordered world. He had chosen to live like this, without attachments, without warmth, because emotions were a weakness. Weakness led to distraction, and distraction was dangerous. At least that was what he had always believed. Then, one morning, something shifted. Eleanor was cleaning Nathaniel's office when she noticed something left behind on his desk. It was a book. That alone was unexpected. She had assumed he only read things related to finance, strategy, and business, but this wasn't anything of the sort. It was a novel. Wuthering Heights. Eleanor hesitated, her natural curiosity outweighing her usual caution. Carefully, she opened the book, her gaze falling on a page marked by a simple leather bookmark. Page 87. One passage had been underlined. It spoke of love, loneliness, and the cruelty of emotion. Words far removed from the world of calculated logic Nathaniel seemed to live by. Before she could fully process it, the sound of approaching footsteps sent a jolt of urgency through her. She barely had time to shut the book before the door opened. Nathaniel stepped into his office, the steady rhythm of his footsteps interrupted only by the sharp silence that followed. His eyes immediately locked onto Eleanor, and then onto the book in her hands. She froze, her fingers tightening around the worn cover, fully aware that she had been caught in an act that could easily be seen as overstepping. "What are you doing?" His voice was measured, but there was an underlying edge to it, something restrained yet unmistakably uncomfortable. "I was just cleaning, sir. The book was already open. I didn't mean to." Eleanor stammered, her words tumbling out in an attempt to explain. Carefully, Nathaniel closed the distance between them, his movements precise, controlled. He reached for the book, taking it from her hands with deliberate slowness. A tense silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken, something that neither of them could quite define. Eleanor could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of it pressing down on her like an invisible force. For the briefest second, their eyes met, and something in Nathaniel's expression faltered. Just for a moment. Then, as if catching himself, he hardened his features once more. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Whitmore." The words were delivered in his usual detached tone, yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind them, something unsaid, something unsettled. Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment as she lowered her head. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." Nathaniel studied her response, his expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he took a step back, seemingly satisfied with her answer. And yet, there was something in his eyes that contradicted the coldness of his words. A hesitation, a flicker of something undecided. "You may go." Eleanor obeyed without another word, slipping out of the office. But her heart still pounded in her chest. It had been such a brief exchange, so insignificant on the surface, and yet she knew that something had shifted. It wasn't just the book. It was the way Nathaniel had looked at her. The way, for a fleeting second, he had seemed less untouchable. Nathaniel, on the other hand, spent the rest of the day trying and failing to push the interaction from his mind. It was absurd. Eleanor was just another employee, no different from the countless others who had passed through his estate, and yet ever since she had set foot in Blackwood Hall, she had disrupted something he had spent years carefully maintaining. His world was one of control, precision, and distance. He had built it that way for a reason. Emotions, attachments, they were weaknesses, liabilities that he had long since learned to shut out. His life, both personal and professional, was calculated. Every detail, every relationship, every decision was made with absolute control. And he had no intention of letting anyone interfere with that. The last time he had let someone close, he had paid the price. Yet somehow, Eleanor seemed to bypass his defenses without even trying. Perhaps it was the way she moved through the house, calm, unobtrusive, never demanding anything from him. Or maybe it was the quiet resilience she carried, a strength that wasn't loud or forceful but deeply rooted. It was unsettling, and no matter how much he told himself it meant nothing, the thought of her refused to leave his mind. The following week, fate conspired against him once again. It was a Friday afternoon, and the relentless Edinburgh rain had turned the streets into a chaotic mess. After canceling yet another appointment, Nathaniel returned home earlier than expected, shaking off his coat as he stepped into the warmth of the house. That was when he heard it, voices drifting from the kitchen. It was unusual. The staff was typically silent in his presence, conducting their duties with quiet efficiency. Curious, he followed the sound. Standing just beyond the doorway, he saw Eleanor engaged in casual conversation with Mrs. Aldridge as she helped set the dinner table. It was an ordinary moment, a scene of simple domesticity, yet something about it made him pause. He wasn't sure why he lingered longer than he should have. Perhaps it was the way Eleanor laughed softly at something the housekeeper had said, a rare moment of warmth breaking through the otherwise structured atmosphere of Blackwood Hall. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel felt like an outsider in his own home, watching something he had long since shut himself away from. Whatever the reason, he didn't move. He just watched. And for the first time in years, he wondered if the life he had built for himself, so precise, so perfectly controlled, had come at a greater cost than he had ever realized. Nathaniel hadn't intended to linger, and yet he did. Standing just beyond the doorway, he found himself watching Eleanor, drawn in by something he couldn't quite define. It wasn't just the way she smiled while speaking with Mrs. Aldridge, nor the quiet ease with which she arranged the table. It was the care in her actions, as if even the smallest details mattered. It was so unlike his own world, where efficiency ruled and emotions had no place. And for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar stir within him. Something that made him wonder what it would be like to be part of that moment, to feel something other than indifference. Then Eleanor's gaze lifted and she saw him. The warmth in her smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to be standing there, watching. Nathaniel stiffened, clearing his throat, a feeble attempt to mask the fact that he had been caught lingering longer than he should have. Mr. Wren, Eleanor greeted, her voice steady, though there was an undeniable shift in the air between them. She gave a small, polite nod, attempting to conceal the unease creeping in. Nathaniel hesitated, then spoke. Eleanor. It was the first time he had called her by name. The moment stretched between them, silent, weighty. And in that silence, Nathaniel realized something unsettling. He was losing control. He should have turned away. He should have ignored whatever this was and walked back to his study, where everything was predictable, controlled, and exactly as he had designed it to be. But for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. And that terrified him more than he was willing to admit. That evening, the storm outside raged harder than before, rain hammering against the tall windows of Blackwood Hall. Nathaniel sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. He had spent his life mastering discipline, logic, and restraint, building walls so high that nothing could reach him. Yet, she had. Not deliberately, not with any intention, but still, she had. Eleanor continued her work in the house with the same quiet dedication, keeping a professional distance as if she sensed that was what he preferred. And yet, Nathaniel noticed the subtle things now. The way her eyes would flicker toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way, no matter how much he tried to avoid it, his own gaze sought her out. He should put an end to it. He should shut it down before it spiraled into something he couldn't control. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. Eleanor, too, felt the change. From the moment she arrived at Blackwood Hall, she had understood that Nathaniel Wren was not a man who invited warmth. He was cold, reserved, and carefully distanced from everyone around him. And yet, bit by bit, she had begun to see something beyond the surface. The way he seemed out of place in his own home, as if he were merely a visitor in a life that was meant to belong to him. The way he avoided unnecessary interactions, not because he was arrogant, but because it almost seemed easier. It made her wonder, what had happened to make him this way? No matter how much she told herself to stop, to mind her own place, curiosity had taken root. And worse than that, so had something else, something far more dangerous. She knew that allowing herself to feel anything for Nathaniel would be a mistake. But every glance, every small exchange, every fleeting moment only made it harder to ignore. 1 week later, the storm had passed. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the gardens of Blackwood Hall, making the air feel lighter, fresher. Eleanor had always loved working in the garden. It was one of the few places where she felt truly at ease, where she could forget the tension that hovered whenever Nathaniel was near. Here, she wasn't a maid working in a house that wasn't hers. She was just a woman tending to the earth, letting her thoughts drift. But today would be different. As she carefully pruned a cluster of roses, she heard footsteps behind her. A presence, a familiar one. Her heartbeat quickened before she even turned. When she finally looked up, Nathaniel was standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different about him today. A heaviness, as if he was carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, in a voice softer than usual, he said, "Eleanor, I need to talk to you." She met his gaze, and somehow, she knew. Whatever he was about to say, everything was about to change. Eleanor hadn't expected him to seek her out. Nathaniel Wren was not a man who engaged in conversations unless they were necessary. He was precise, calculating. Every word, every action had a purpose. And yet, here he was, standing before her in the garden, his expression unreadable. She quickly wiped her dirt-stained hands against her trousers, trying to compose herself, though her pulse had quickened at his unexpected presence. "Of course, sir. How can I help you?" Her voice was professional, steady, but her heart was not. Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze flickering with something undecipherable. It was rare for him to pause before speaking, as if choosing his words with unusual care. Finally, he exhaled. "I've noticed that things between us have changed." His voice was low, controlled, yet there was an edge of uncertainty beneath it. And to be blunt, it bothers me. His words hit like a sudden gust of cold wind. Eleanor felt an uncomfortable tightness in her chest, an immediate fear of what might come next. He had noticed. Of course, he had. But the way he spoke, the fact that this change was not something he welcomed, made her stomach twist. "If I've done something wrong, sir, I apologize." The words left her lips quickly, almost instinctively. "That was never my intention." Nathaniel stepped closer, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "No, you didn't do anything wrong, Eleanor." She swallowed hard, caught in the intensity of the moment. He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, as if forcing himself to say something he had spent days, weeks, trying to suppress. "I just don't know how to deal with it." For Nathaniel Wren to admit something like that, to admit that something was beyond his control, was staggering. Eleanor remained silent, trying to process his words. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he continued, his tone edged with frustration. "But ever since you arrived, something has shifted. And no matter how much I try to ignore it, I can't." The confession shook her. Nathaniel was struggling with something, and for the first time, he was admitting it openly. She knew she should step away, should put distance between them before they crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. But her heart wasn't as rational as her mind. "Nathaniel," she said, using his first name for the first time. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I understand that this is complicated," she continued, keeping her voice even. "I feel it too, but you're my employer, and I don't know if this is a path we can take." A heavy silence settled between them. Nathaniel stared at her, absorbing her words, knowing she was right. The situation was dangerous, messy, impossible. And yet, "I know it's complicated." His voice was quieter now, less certain. "But I can't pretend nothing's happening." Eleanor held his gaze, and for a fleeting moment she saw something in his expression that shook her. Vulnerability. Nathaniel Wren, the man who kept the world at arm's length, was standing before her with his defenses lowered, no longer the unshakable figure of control he had always been. And it terrified her. "Maybe we should take a step back," she suggested, forcing reason to override emotion. "Keep things professional." Nathaniel hesitated. Everything in his mind told him she was right. He should agree. He should walk away. He should return to the distance he had always known how to maintain. But for the first time, he didn't want to. "I can try." The hint of a smile ghosted his lips, a rare, unexpected thing. It startled Eleanor, but it also did something far more dangerous. It made her smile back. And in that moment, without saying another word, they both knew this would not be the end of it. The tension between them had not disappeared. It had merely settled, lurking beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Nathaniel had tried to go back to the way things were. He had convinced himself that what happened in the garden was nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness. But every time he saw Eleanor, he was reminded that it was a lie. On the other hand, Eleanor tried to continue her work as if nothing had changed. But his words, his unfiltered honesty, had left her shaken. They had both agreed to keep things professional. And yet, with every glance, every accidental brush of proximity, it became increasingly clear. This was not something they could simply ignore. And fate, it seemed, had no intention of letting them. The mansion continued its usual rhythm, yet everything felt off balance. Each day was a battle between what should be and what was inevitably happening. Nathaniel tried to bury himself in work, forcing himself to remain detached. Eleanor did the same, keeping her distance, keeping her head down. But there were moments, quiet, stolen moments, where neither could deny that something was unraveling between them. A glance across the room, a moment of hesitation, the way his presence could shift the air around her. It was a delicate thread stretched too thin, and all it would take was one small pull for it to snap. And that pull came in the form of Charles Redmond. The unexpected arrival of a guest set everything further off course. Charles Redmond was an old friend of Nathaniel's, a fellow businessman, charming, confident, and impossible to ignore. He was the kind of man who filled a room with effortless ease, a stark contrast to Nathaniel's silent, brooding presence. Eleanor had heard the staff speak of Charles before, his sharp wit, his easy smile, his tendency to disrupt the usual stillness of Blackwood Hall. But this time, something was different. From the moment Charles arrived, his attention was on her. And Nathaniel noticed. That evening, a formal dinner was held in Charles's honor, as was tradition whenever he visited. Eleanor moved quietly through the dining hall, ensuring everything was in place. She was used to blending into the background, to being invisible in rooms filled with powerful men. But Charles didn't let her remain invisible. Seated at the long dining table, he turned his attention toward her the moment she stepped forward to refill his glass. "Eleanor, isn't it?" His voice was smooth, carrying the unmistakable ease of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. She nodded politely, keeping her posture professional. "Yes, Mr. Redmond. Can I pour you more wine?" Charles smiled, his gaze lingering a fraction too long. "No need for the formalities, just Charles will do." His tone was warm, but there was something beneath it, something that felt a little too calculated. Nathaniel said nothing, but Eleanor could feel his presence sharpen, like a blade poised just beneath the surface. "How long have you been working here?" Charles continued, curiosity laced in his tone. Eleanor hesitated just for a second before answering. "A few months." Her voice remained neutral, unwavering, but when she cast a quick glance toward Nathaniel, she saw it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his grip on his glass subtly shifted, the way his entire demeanor darkened, though he said nothing at all. There it was, the reaction she hadn't expected, the reaction she wasn't sure he even realized he was having. Charles, however, was not the type to miss things. His smile remained easy, but there was a flicker of something sharper in his eyes, something that hinted at understanding far more than he let on. Just as he opened his mouth to speak again, Nathaniel's voice cut through the air, sharp, controlled, unmistakably final. "Eleanor is busy, Charles." A simple statement, yet there was no mistaking the edge in his tone. "I'm sure you can help yourself if you need anything." The unspoken message was clear. The conversation was over. Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and unease, stepping away quickly. But as she left, she caught one last glance between the two men. Charles, watching Nathaniel with a knowing expression. Nathaniel, staring back, unflinching, unreadable. Something was happening, and for the first time, Eleanor realized she wasn't the only one who felt it. There was something unspoken between them, a rivalry, an old wound, and now Eleanor realized she was standing at the center of it. She hadn't meant to be, she hadn't wanted to be. But Nathaniel and Charles had made it clear, whether through words or silence, that this tension had existed long before she arrived, and now it was on the surface. After dinner, Eleanor retreated to the kitchen, trying to focus on her work, but her mind was restless. She couldn't stop replaying the way Nathaniel had reacted at the table. Had that been jealousy? It seemed impossible. Unbelievable. And yet, beneath that cold, impassive mask, was there a man who was struggling with his own emotions just as much as she was? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, firm, deliberate. When she turned, he was there. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his presence dark and overwhelming, his gaze locked onto her. The air between them shifted, growing heavy. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the dish she was cleaning before she forced herself to speak. "Is everything all right, sir?" Her voice was composed, but she couldn't hide the surprise at seeing him here, like this. Nathaniel took a few slow steps forward. Something about him seemed unsettled, as if he was at war with himself. Then, finally, he spoke. "Charles shouldn't have spoken to you like that." His words were clipped, his voice firm. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the statement. He was just being polite. She tried to dismiss it, to smooth over whatever was simmering beneath his surface. But Nathaniel's expression told her he saw things very differently. No, he wasn't. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with irritation. "He always does this. Walks into my home, crosses lines that aren't his to cross." Eleanor studied him, trying to understand why this had affected him so much. She knew Charles could be bold, flirtatious, but she hadn't expected it to rattle Nathaniel like this. Before she could think better of it, the words slipped from her lips. "Are you jealous?" A long silence followed. Nathaniel stared at her, his gaze piercing, unreadable. Then his voice came, low, almost a whisper. "I'm not the kind of man who gets jealous." The way he said it made her shiver, not because it was a denial, but because it felt like an admission. Then he took a step closer. "But with you, it's different." The words hung between them, heavy, inescapable. Eleanor's breath caught. She had known, deep down, that something had been building between them. But hearing him say it, acknowledging it, even in an indirect way, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Nathaniel, this isn't." She tried to speak, to put distance between them, but he cut her off. "I've tried, Eleanor." Another step closer. I've tried to keep my distance, to keep things professional like you suggested." His voice was tight, filled with something raw and unguarded. "But every time I see you, every time Charles, Kai, or any other man looks at you like that, something inside me—" He stopped, took a deep breath, as if struggling to say the words. Then finally, "I can't ignore it anymore." Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding. The sincerity in his voice, in his eyes, was overwhelming. And no matter how much she tried to keep her walls intact, she knew her own feelings were on the verge of spilling over. But she forced herself to ask, "And what do you want from me, Nathaniel?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried weight. She needed to hear it. She needed to know. His eyes held hers, dark and filled with something unspoken. "I don't know." The words were quiet, almost helpless. "I just know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want you to go." Eleanor's breath hitched. She had known his feelings were complicated, but she had never expected him to say them out loud. Not like this. Not with this kind of bare, unguarded honesty. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. "I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel." Her voice was soft but firm. "But you have to understand that this, whatever this is, it's dangerous, and I can't let myself fall unless I know you'll be there to catch me." Another step. Now he was so close she could barely breathe. His voice dropped, lower, rougher. "I'm willing to try, Eleanor." A pause. "I'm not perfect, but I don't want these feelings to consume me any more than they already have." He hesitated, then softer. "I want you by my side." For so long, Eleanor had kept her distance, building walls to protect herself. But now, standing before Nathaniel, seeing the raw honesty in his gaze, the unguarded vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show before, she knew she was ready to take that step too. A shaky breath, a moment of hesitation. Then, "So, are we in this together?" Her voice was soft, laced with both fear and hope. Nathaniel held her gaze, unwavering. Together. And at that moment, beneath the weight of their unspoken confession, Eleanor knew. Despite all the complications, despite the storm they would undoubtedly face, she was willing to risk everything. Because for the first time, Nathaniel was ready to open his heart, and so was she. The days following Nathaniel's confession carried a new energy throughout Blackwood Hall. Even though they both knew this path would not be easy, there was now something lighter between them, a quiet understanding that hadn't existed before. Eleanor continued with her daily tasks, maintaining the same dedication and professionalism as always. But now, when her eyes met Nathaniel's across a room, there was something different, an unspoken promise, a silent acknowledgement that no matter how difficult things became, they would face it together. But reality had a way of testing even the strongest promises, and soon it did. Charles Redmond was still at the mansion, and his presence had never unsettled Nathaniel more than it did now. Before, Charles's casual flirtations and teasing remarks had been nothing more than a mild annoyance. But now, every seemingly harmless comment carried weight, a weight that pressed too heavily on Nathaniel's patience. One evening, during a formal dinner, Charles made a remark that sent a chill through the air. Swirling the wine in his glass, he spoke with a smirk, his tone light, yet laced with something deliberate. "You know, Nathaniel, a maid like Eleanor is a real treasure, isn't she?" Nathaniel's grip on his fork tightened. "Smart, hardworking, and incredibly beautiful." Charles glanced toward Eleanor, his smile lingering. "You don't come across people like that very often these days." The words were said in an offhanded way, as if they were nothing more than a casual observation. But everyone at the table felt the tension shift. Eleanor, who had been serving a dish at that very moment, nearly dropped the plate in her hands. Heat rushed to her face as she quickly looked down, avoiding Nathaniel's gaze. She could feel him watching her. And then, in the silence that followed, his voice cut through the air like ice. "Charles?" A pause. Then, "I think it's best if we focus on business and leave discussions about my staff out of it." His voice was controlled, but the edge in his tone was unmistakable. Charles raised his brows, clearly caught off guard by the warning beneath Nathaniel's words. For a moment, the tension between them thickened, an unspoken challenge passing between the two men. Then Charles let out a soft chuckle, trying to ease the weight of the moment. "I didn't realize you were so sensitive about your employees, Nathaniel." He smirked, lifting his glass. "I was only joking." But Nathaniel didn't smile. didn't look away, didn't allow anyone at that table to believe for a second that his words had been a joke. And that was the moment Eleanor realized. Whatever this was between them, Nathaniel was no longer hiding it. After dinner, Eleanor slipped away into the gardens, seeking a moment of quiet. The sky was overcast, a soft breeze whispering through the trees. She sat on a stone bench, hugging her arms around herself as she tried to make sense of everything. She knew Nathaniel had defended her, but she also knew that this wouldn't be the last time their relationship was tested. The real challenges were still ahead of them. She was lost in thought when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. The moment she turned, she already knew who it was. Nathaniel had changed from his formal suit into something more casual, the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone, but his expression was the same as before, intense, searching. He sat beside her on the bench, his presence so close, yet so hesitant. A pause. Then, "I need to apologize for dinner." His voice was quiet, but there was weight behind it. Eleanor turned toward him, waiting. "Charles crossed a line," he continued, his gaze fixed on the ground. "And I shouldn't have let it happen." She shook her head, trying not to show how much his words affected her. But deep down she knew the truth. Nathaniel Wren was not a man who apologized easily. And yet, here he was, apologizing to her. And that meant something. Something she wasn't ready to name, but something that could no longer be ignored. Eleanor sighed, shaking her head slightly. "You stood up for me, Nathaniel. That's what matters." Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength behind it. Nathaniel had expected her to be upset, perhaps even unsettled by the way he had confronted Charles during dinner. Instead, she was calm, as if she had already come to terms with something he was only just beginning to accept. But still, this wasn't going to be easy. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke again. "But this..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This won't be simple, and we both know it." Nathaniel exhaled, looking up at the overcast sky, knowing she was right. Charles wasn't the only obstacle. Society had its rules, the world he lived in, the expectations placed upon him, the difference in status, privilege, and reputation. All of these things had shaped him. And now, for the first time, he was willing to challenge them. "I know it won't be easy," he admitted at last, "but I can't go back, Eleanor. Not after everything I feel for you." Eleanor's breath caught. A part of her had been waiting for him to say it. Another part had been afraid of hearing it, because once it was spoken, there would be no turning back. Nathaniel was breaking his own rules, stepping beyond the careful lines he had drawn for himself. And now she had to decide if she was willing to meet him halfway. "I just don't want you to regret it." Her voice was barely above a whisper, her gaze drifting away as if she was afraid to see the answer in his eyes. Nathaniel turned to her, his hands reaching for hers, a rare, deliberate gesture. "The only thing I would regret is losing you." His fingers tightened gently around hers, his expression unwavering. "I know it's going to be difficult, but I'm willing to face whatever it takes." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. She had spent so much time guarding her heart, keeping herself at a distance, afraid of what it would mean if she let herself fall. But here he was, Nathaniel Wren, a man who had never allowed emotions to dictate his choices, standing before her, choosing her. And in that moment, she realized she was willing to choose him too. A slow breath, a decision. "Then let's try," she said at last. But her voice was careful, measured, because she knew this was only the beginning. Nathaniel nodded, relief flickering across his face. For the first time in a long time, he was making a decision with his heart, not his logic. And strangely, the lack of control didn't scare him as much as it should have. The next morning, Charles left Blackwood Hall. His departure was brief, unceremonious. But despite the easy smile he wore, Eleanor knew the truth. Charles had noticed the tension between her and Nathaniel. And Charles was not a man who missed details. As she watched him step into his car, a quiet unease settled in her chest. He knew something, and she feared that he would take more than just fond memories with him when he left. With Charles gone, the mansion returned to a fragile calm. Eleanor and Nathaniel continued to navigate their delicate, unspoken relationship, exchanging quiet glances and stolen moments whenever they could. It was as if they were carving out a space of their own, a world untouched by the expectations that surrounded them. But they both knew, The real challenges had yet to come, and neither of them expected the first storm to arrive so soon. It happened on an otherwise ordinary morning. Eleanor was sorting through fresh linens when the phone in the servants' quarters rang, a sound she had come to associate with routine calls and simple requests. But when she picked up the receiver and heard her mother's voice, she knew this was not routine. There was fear in her tone. "Eleanor, something's wrong." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "What do you mean? What happened?" "The bank called. They said we don't have enough funds to cover the bills this month." Her mother's voice wavered. "I don't understand. You send money every month? It should be enough." Eleanor's breath hitched. That didn't make sense. She had been sending money home regularly since the day she started working at Blackwood Hall. It had always been enough. But now, something was wrong. And she had to find out why. Her heart pounded as she gripped the phone tighter. "I'll come right away." But as she said the words, a cold realization settled over her. This wasn't just about money. This was about choosing between two worlds. If her family was in financial trouble, she had no choice but to put them first. But it also meant stepping away from the fragile things she had just begun to build with Nathaniel. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears as she walked through the grand hallways of the mansion, her footsteps heavy with uncertainty, and for the first time she realized she might have to make a choice that could change everything. Eleanor didn't know what she would find when she returned home. Her mind was in turmoil, a storm of unanswered questions. The pressure of keeping everything under control, the fragile balance between her family and the life she had started at Blackwood Hall was beginning to overwhelm her. For as long as she could remember, her family had been her priority. Up until now, her job at the mansion had allowed her to send money home, ensuring that the household bills were covered. But now, something had changed, and she needed to find out why. But before she could leave, she had to do something even more difficult: tell Nathaniel. Would he understand? Would a man who was so accustomed to control and stability accept that she was leaving, even temporarily? Or would he see her absence as a threat to what they had just begun to build? The thought unsettled her. And yet, she knew there was no other choice. Arriving at Nathaniel's office, she paused outside the door, hesitating. Then she took a steadying breath and knocked. A moment later, his voice came from within, calm, firm, unwavering. "Come in." She stepped inside. He was at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, looking as serious as ever. But as soon as his eyes lifted to meet hers, his expression softened, just slightly but noticeably. "Eleanor." Her name sounded different when he said it, quieter, like an invitation rather than a command. "Is everything all right?" She took another breath, willing herself to stay calm. "I got a call from my mother." She forced the words out faster than she would have liked, her nervousness clear. "Something is wrong with my family's finances. I need to go home and sort it out." The room fell silent. Nathaniel didn't respond right away, and the pause only made Eleanor's anxiety grow. Then, after a long moment, he stood up slowly, walking toward her with deliberate steps. When he spoke, his voice was even, unreadable. "How long do you need?" Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding an explanation. He was just serious. "I don't know," she admitted, still processing his reaction. "It could be quick, but depending on what I find, it might take a few days." Nathaniel studied her carefully. She could feel the weight of his gaze. For a man who valued control above all else, she had expected resistance, hesitation, even frustration. But instead, he simply nodded. "If you need more time, take it." His tone was steady, unwavering. "Your family is important, Eleanor. I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between them and what we're trying to build." A wave of relief washed over her. She hadn't realized just how much she had been dreading this conversation until that moment. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said softly. His eyes lingered on hers, something unspoken passing between them. Then, without a word, he took another step forward. His hands came to rest gently on her shoulders, his touch firm yet careful. And when he spoke next, there was a quiet promise in his voice. "If you need help, any kind of help, don't hesitate to come to me." Eleanor swallowed hard. Nathaniel Wren was not a man to make empty offers. If he said he would help, he meant it, and that meant more than she could put into words. "I'll fix it," she said with a small, tight smile. "I just need to figure out what's going on." Nathaniel watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. But he knew. He knew how much her family meant to her, and even though a part of him wanted to keep her close, he understood this was something she had to do. A brief pause. Then, his voice softened. "I know it will work out. And then, quieter, almost hesitant, when you get back, I'll be here." Eleanor felt those words settle deep in her chest, pressing against her heart. She knew the feelings between them were real, but she also knew that in Nathaniel's world, absence could be interpreted in many ways. She could only hope that this temporary separation would not unravel what they had just begun to build. The next morning, Eleanor left Blackwood Hall. As the carriage moved away from the grand estate, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: anxiety, longing, uncertainty. Every mile that passed seemed to add to the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She had no idea what awaited her at home. But she knew one thing: when she returned, nothing would be the same. When she finally arrived, the sight that greeted her sent a fresh wave of worry through her chest. Her mother stood at the kitchen table, papers scattered before her, her expression tight with concern. And in that moment, Eleanor realized, whatever was happening, it was worse than she had feared. Eleanor wasted no time. The moment she arrived home, she dived into the mess of paperwork, searching for an explanation. Hours passed in a blur of calculations, bank statements, and unfamiliar documents. And then she found it, the truth she had feared. Her mother had fallen victim to a fraudulent investment scheme. A company promising quick returns and financial security had convinced her to entrust them with her savings. Desperation had made her believe in the illusion of easy money. Now, everything was gone. The accounts were overdrawn. The debt was worse than Eleanor had imagined. She turned to her mother, her voice tight with frustration and concern. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" Her mother looked away, guilt written across her tired face. "I didn't want to worry you, darling." Her voice trembled. "I thought I was doing the right thing, investing for our future." Eleanor's chest tightened. Her mother's regret was clear, and it hurt to see it. She forced herself to stay calm, even though her own panic was rising beneath the surface. "We'll figure this out." Her voice was steady, though she barely believed the words herself. "I promise I'll find a solution." But deep down she knew this wouldn't be easy. She had already been sending most of her income home, stretching every penny to make sure her family was taken care of. And now, with this debt hanging over them, everything was at risk. She thought about Nathaniel, about what he had said before she left. "If you need help, any kind of help, don't hesitate to come to me." The memory made her chest tighten. Nathaniel wasn't the type to offer something he didn't mean. And yet, the thought of pulling him into this, dragging his world into her personal crisis, made her uneasy. But as the days passed and the weight of the financial burden grew heavier, Eleanor began to realize she might not have a choice. Back at Blackwood Hall, Nathaniel tried to ignore the hollow feeling her absence left behind. At first, he told himself it was manageable. After all, he had lived years without letting anyone get close, without letting anyone matter. But this was different. Days passed, and yet, the quiet of the house felt wrong. Nathaniel was used to control, order, and routine. But now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, his focus was fractured. His thoughts drifted constantly. To Eleanor, to the uncertainty of her situation, to the fact that she hadn't called. And he hated it. He wasn't a man who let emotions dictate his actions. But Eleanor had changed that. He knew it the moment she walked out of the mansion's doors, leaving him with a promise to return. And now he wasn't sure he could just wait. On the third night since Eleanor's departure, Nathaniel made a decision. He knew she wouldn't accept his help easily. She was proud, independent. She would rather fight through this alone than ask for assistance. But that didn't mean he was going to let her. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Nathaniel?" "Lucas, I need a favor." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Lucas, his most trusted confidant and legal advisor, didn't ask questions. He simply listened. "There's a fraudulent investment firm," Nathaniel continued, "and I have reason to believe they've taken advantage of Eleanor's mother." There was a brief pause. Then Lucas's voice came through, steady and businesslike. What do you need me to do? Find out everything. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. I want names, transactions, every single detail about this company. Because whoever had done this, they weren't just going to get away with it. Lucas asked a few quick questions before promising to investigate. Nathaniel knew that with the right connections, he could find a solution, even if Eleanor never knew he had been involved. As he hung up the phone, a rare, unfamiliar sensation settled over him. Anxiety. He hadn't felt it in years. But now, for the first time in a long time, he realized he was afraid. Afraid that he wouldn't be able to fix this fast enough. Afraid that she wouldn't come back. Afraid that this decision, more than any other, would change everything between them. And for once, he wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. For Eleanor, the days back home were an emotional storm. Her mother's guilt weighed heavily on the household. The mounting bills, the never-ending paperwork, the uncertainty, it was all too much. She spent hours trying to piece together a solution, but nothing seemed to be enough. Every moment she wasn't working through finances, her thoughts drifted back to Blackwood Hall. Back to Nathaniel. She missed him more than she wanted to admit. But the idea of dragging him, his powerful, structured world, into this chaos, it felt impossible. Nathaniel had enough to deal with. He was a man of business, wealth, and influence. He had built his life on structure and control. Wouldn't her problems, her messy, complicated world, be nothing more than an inconvenience? She didn't know the answer. But she knew one thing. The longer she stayed away, the harder it would be to go back. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for what that meant. Eleanor had convinced herself that this was her burden to bear alone. Nathaniel had enough responsibilities, his empire, his business dealings, his carefully structured life. She couldn't be another weight on his shoulders. What she didn't know was that he had already gone ahead of her. Back at Blackwood Hall, Nathaniel found himself unable to focus. For the first time in years, his carefully controlled world felt unsteady. He knew Eleanor was strong, independent, determined, but that wasn't enough. Because knowing that wasn't the same as being able to protect her. And Nathaniel needed to protect her. It was more than just an impulse. It was an undeniable, unshakable instinct, one he wasn't willing to ignore. So he had done what needed to be done. He had called Lucas, his longtime friend and lawyer, and instructed him to dig into the fraud that had stolen Eleanor's mother's savings. Nathaniel wasn't the kind of man to stand by and watch, and he wasn't about to start now. 3 days after the call, Lucas returned with information. Nathaniel sat at his desk, fingers tapping against the polished wood as he listened to the voice on the other end of the phone. I looked into the investment firm you mentioned, Lucas began, his tone serious. They were already on our radar for fraudulent schemes. They've scammed dozens of people, promising high returns, then disappearing with the money. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. And Eleanor's mother? He asked directly, cutting past the details. Lucas sighed. She was one of the victims, but there's a chance of recovering some of the money. Nathaniel leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. How? We're working with a legal team to trace the embezzled funds. It's complicated, but not impossible. Nathaniel's mind was already 10 steps ahead, formulating the next course of action. Make her mother the priority, he ordered. I want this handled quickly. Understood. I'll do what I can. Nathaniel ended the call, exhaling slowly. Relief, but also worry. He knew he had done the right thing. But he also knew Eleanor. She wouldn't accept his help easily. She was proud, and if she found out he had stepped in behind the scenes, it could drive a wedge between them. But for him, it was a risk worth taking. Right now, the only thing that mattered was making sure she and her family were safe. Days later, Eleanor returned to Blackwood Hall. The financial problems weren't completely resolved, but she had done what she could, finding temporary solutions to keep things under control. Still, the weight of uncertainty followed her back. As she climbed the grand staircase, she felt a tightness in her chest. How was she supposed to explain everything to Nathaniel? She had expected to find the mansion as quiet as she had left it. Instead, the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, was waiting for her. Mr. Wren is in his study, she informed her. He wants to see you as soon as you arrive. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had known this conversation was inevitable. She just hadn't expected it this soon. When Eleanor stepped into Nathaniel's office, He was standing by the window, his back to her. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment she hesitated. Then he turned. His expression softened the moment he saw her, but there was something else in his gaze. A tension, a knowing. And before he even spoke, Eleanor had the sinking feeling that he knew more than she had told him. How was the trip? His voice was low, controlled. Eleanor exhaled, trying to keep her emotions in check. Hard, she admitted, not sugarcoating the truth. Things at home are complicated. Nathaniel said nothing, waiting. My mother was scammed, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotions pressing against her ribs. She lost everything. She expected him to react, surprise, anger, something. But instead, he just nodded, as if he already knew. Eleanor frowned. And then, after a long pause, Nathaniel finally spoke. Eleanor. His voice was firm but careful. There's something I need to tell you. A cold feeling spread through her stomach. What do you mean? Nathaniel took a step closer, holding her gaze. I know about the fraud. Eleanor's breath caught. Her entire body went rigid. What? She stared at him, a mix of shock, confusion, and something dangerously close to betrayal. What do you mean you know? Her tone was sharp, defensive before she could stop herself. Nathaniel took another step forward, unflinching. I had Lucas investigate, he admitted. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Eleanor's mind spun. He had known. He had known before she even walked back into this house. She should have been relieved, grateful even. But instead, all she could feel was a tightening in her chest. Because Nathaniel hadn't asked, he had decided on his own. And that changed everything. Eleanor's breath caught. Nathaniel's words hung in the air, steady and unshaken. I asked Lucas to investigate the situation. The company that scammed your mother is already under legal scrutiny for multiple fraud cases. I've had my lawyers start working on recovering the stolen money. His voice was calm, too calm, as if he had anticipated this reaction. But Eleanor felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. Her stomach twisted, not from the problem itself, but from the fact that he had done this without telling her. Her voice wavered between shock and frustration as she found her words. You did this without telling me? Nathaniel didn't flinch. Eleanor, this is none of your business. I should solve this myself. Her voice was sharp, but beneath the frustration lay something more complicated. A mix of gratitude, disbelief, and an unspoken fear that this would change things between them. Nathaniel exhaled, steadying himself before responding. I know you can handle this on your own, Eleanor. His voice was low but firm. But I can't just stand by and watch. A pause, then softer. You're important to me. I can't pretend that your problems don't affect me. The raw honesty in his words made Eleanor's anger waver. She wanted to be furious with him for interfering. But how could she, when she knew why he had done it? Nathaniel Wren wasn't a man who expressed emotions easily, and the very fact that he had taken this step without hesitation, without second-guessing himself, only proved how much he cared. Still, Eleanor shook her head, trying to regain her footing. Nathaniel, this is complicated. She struggled to find the right words. I can't let you fix my family's problems for me. He didn't let her finish. I'm not fixing them for you. His voice was controlled, unwavering. I'm doing this because I care about you, because you're part of my life now, and what happens to you, it affects me. Eleanor's heart pounded. If it were the other way around, you'd do the same for me, wouldn't you? She hesitated, because the truth was yes. If it had been Nathaniel struggling, if he had been in trouble, she wouldn't have stood idly by. She would have fought for him, just as fiercely, just as relentlessly. But accepting that truth was harder than she expected. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I just don't want this to change what we have. Her voice was quieter now, filled with emotions she wasn't sure how to express. I don't want you to think I need you to solve my problems. Nathaniel stepped closer. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hand, tilting her chin up so that she had no choice but to look at him. What we have doesn't depend on that. His voice was softer now, but there was a certainty in his tone that made her chest tighten. And I'm not here to be the solution to all your problems, Eleanor. A pause. I just want you to know that when things get difficult, I'm here. That's not going to change. Eleanor's eyes burned, but she held back the tears. There was so much she wanted to say. So much she still needed to understand. About herself, about him, about what they were building together. But in that moment, what Nathaniel was offering her wasn't a solution. It was unconditional support, and that was exactly what she needed. Her throat tightened as she finally spoke the words that had been resting on the tip of her tongue for so long. "I love you, Nathaniel." It was quiet, uncertain, but true. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if absorbing the weight of those words. Then, slowly, he smiled. A rare, soft, genuine smile. He leaned in, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "And I love you, Eleanor." His voice was quiet, full of something unbreakable. "I'm not going anywhere." And when he kissed her, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. A promise that, no matter what obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together. The days following Eleanor's return to Blackwood Hall were strangely quiet. But beneath the surface, an invisible tension remained. She and Nathaniel had grown closer than ever, opening doors to emotions they had both tried to keep locked away. But that didn't mean the struggle was over. Eleanor, though deeply touched by Nathaniel's help, couldn't shake the feeling that her independence was slipping. Her love for him grew with every passing day. But along with that love came a new fear. A fear that in some way she was losing herself in his world. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Not yet. With love came fear. Fear of losing herself, of waking up one day and realizing she had become someone she no longer recognized. For so long, Eleanor had been independent, capable of facing her struggles head-on. But now, standing in the vast halls of Blackwood Hall, with Nathaniel having taken control of her situation, she felt torn. She loved him. She knew that now. But love, as she was learning, had its own battles. Nathaniel, on the other hand, could sense her hesitation. He was a man who thrived on control, on solving problems before they spiraled, on ensuring everything around him remained precise and manageable. But for the first time in his life, he found himself standing at the edge of a boundary he wasn't sure how to cross. There was a fine line between helping and overstepping, between protecting and suffocating, and as much as he loved her, he didn't know how to navigate this without making her feel trapped. However, before they could address the storm brewing between them, something outside their control began to unfold, and it threatened to tear everything apart. It happened on a quiet afternoon. Eleanor had been walking through the gardens of Blackwood Hall, lost in thought, trying to untangle the emotions that had taken root inside her. Then, her phone rang. The number was unknown. Hesitant, she answered. The voice on the other end was calm, formal, but unmistakably calculated. "Miss Whitmore?" Her breath hitched. "Who is this?" "My name's John Reynolds. I'm a journalist for the Financial Observer." A cold chill ran down her spine. "I'm currently investigating a story on the recent investment fraud that has affected several families." Silence stretched between them. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her phone. "And I understand that you're involved." Her stomach dropped. "I'd like to discuss the story with you," the journalist continued, his tone smooth, too practiced. "To better understand how this situation has affected your family, and of course, your relationship with Nathaniel Wren." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about the fraud anymore. This was about them. About her and Nathaniel. She gritted her teeth, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have nothing to say about it." "Miss Whitmore," Reynolds replied, his tone persuasive, almost amused. "People will talk regardless. Wouldn't it be better if your story was told the right way?" Her grip on the phone tightened. "I want to avoid misunderstandings," the journalist added smoothly, "and give you a chance to clarify your position." Clarify. As if the truth wasn't enough, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ended the call and ran. She didn't care about the whispers of the staff as she stormed through the corridors of the mansion. Her pulse was thundering in her ears as she reached Nathaniel's office, throwing the door open without a second thought. Nathaniel was on the phone, but the moment he saw her expression, he hung up immediately. What happened? He was already moving toward her, concern darkening his features. Eleanor forced the words out, her voice tight, panicked. "A journalist called me." Nathaniel's expression shifted instantly, not with shock, but with understanding. He already knew this was coming. "They know about the fraud." She took a breath. "They know I'm involved." And then the final blow. "And they know about us." Silence. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring as he processed her words. He had dealt with the media before. He had faced rumors, scandals, power plays disguised as stories. But this was different, because now Eleanor was caught in the middle of it, and he would not let them touch her. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice controlled. But Eleanor shook her head, her heart racing. "It's not that simple, Nathaniel." She stepped closer, her fear pressing against her ribs like a vice. "They won't stop until they have a story, and if that story gets out the wrong way—" She swallowed hard. "They'll twist everything." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to stay strong. "They'll say I'm with you because of the money, that you solved my problems because I'm your maid, that this was all a calculated move." Nathaniel's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening, as if her words had physically struck him. Because she was right, that's exactly what they would do. The media didn't care about truth. They cared about scandal. About powerful men and the women they supposedly rescued. They would turn Eleanor into a cautionary tale, a gold digger, a pawn in a game she had never asked to play. And worse, they would use this to undermine him too. His business, his reputation, everything he had built. But more than anything, they would hurt her, and that he would not allow. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think clearly. Then he met Eleanor's gaze with a dangerous determination. "Then we don't let them tell the story." A beat of silence. Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile, one that held both promise and warning. "We tell it first." Nathaniel knew exactly how the media worked. They wouldn't hesitate to twist the truth, to take something personal and turn it into a spectacle for the world to devour. And worst of all, if he wasn't careful, Eleanor wouldn't just be dragged into the scandal, she would be painted as the villain. A woman who had taken advantage of a powerful man. A desperate maid who had used her circumstances to manipulate her way into his life. A story that wasn't real, but one that people would believe. And that he would not allow. He stepped closer to her, his voice unwavering. "You're not going to face this alone." Eleanor swallowed hard, the fear still pressing against her chest. "Nathaniel, what if this destroys your reputation?" Her voice was shaky. "I don't want to be the reason for a scandal. I don't want people to think I—" She broke off, struggling against the emotion rising in her throat. But Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He reached for her hands, his grip firm, grounding her. "I don't care what the media says." His words were steady, filled with a conviction she had never heard from him before. "I don't care what the world thinks." He lifted a hand, brushing his thumb gently over her cheek. "What matters is what we have, and no journalist, no rumor, no scandal can take that away from us." Eleanor took a shaky breath, trying to absorb the strength he was offering her. And then she realized. He was right. The world could whisper all it wanted. The press could speculate, distort, fabricate, but what they had was real, and that was worth fighting for. The next morning, Nathaniel and Eleanor made a decision. They would not hide. They would not let others tell their story for them. Instead, they would control the narrative. They agreed to a single, carefully planned interview, a chance to set the record straight before the media could tear them apart. The meeting was arranged in a quiet, discreet cafe, far from prying eyes. John Reynolds, the journalist, arrived expecting scandal, tension, something explosive. But what he found was something entirely different. Nathaniel, ever composed and controlled, spoke first. He laid out the truth. How Eleanor's mother had fallen victim to a fraudulent investment scheme, how he had used his resources to help track down the missing funds, and how their relationship had developed long before any of it had come to light. There was no manipulation. No hidden agenda, just two people who had found each other despite the circumstances. Then Eleanor spoke. She talked about her own struggles, about how she had worked tirelessly to support her family. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't act like she needed saving, because she didn't. She had built a life for herself long before Nathaniel had come into the picture. She had worked for her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. The journalist, who had likely expected a dramatic affair, seemed almost taken aback by their honesty. There was no scandal, no hidden motives, just a man and a woman standing side by side, unwilling to let the world define them. When the interview ended, Eleanor and Nathaniel walked out of the cafe hand in hand, their steps strong, their gazes forward. There would still be challenges ahead. The press wouldn't back down overnight. The rumors wouldn't vanish immediately. But they had made their stand, and they had done it together. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Eleanor turned to Nathaniel, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I think we can handle anything now." Nathaniel chuckled, squeezing her hand a little tighter. "Together. Always." And in that moment, they knew. No matter what storm came their way, no matter what the world threw at them, they had something stronger than the headlines. They had each other.